You're listening to another ambitious Entrepreneur Network.com podcast, the voice for entrepreneurs and small business. Now, onto the show.
Welcome to the Christian Entrepreneurs Podcast, featuring Christian entrepreneurs to inspire and empower Christian business owners to walk strongly in their faith, while building a thriving business that honors Him in every way. Now, over to your host, Anne-Marie Cross.
And welcome to another episode of the Christian Entrepreneurs Podcast, brought to you by the influencealliance.com, the business building community for coaches and consultants who want to make a much bigger impact with their message. And yes, I'm your host, Anne-Marie Cross. Now, my guest today says it makes her heart sing when she sees her people making purposeful change in their lives. And joining me on today's show is Estelle Kelly. Estelle, she's a retirement life coach who assists people struggling with the uncertainties of navigating retirement. And she works with nurturing professionals aged 55 years plus who are not really sure what the next stage of life is for them, particularly with educators, health workers, and social workers. Now, when it comes to planning a fulfilling life ahead for themselves, they are a little overwhelmed by the very thought of what is next for them. They have successfully worked a few decades in their profession and they're thinking about retirement, but something is holding them back. Now, on today's show, Estelle's going to share that knowledge is never a burden. She's going to speak about learning to listen to others, as well as why loyalty can be a detriment as well as a benefit. So let's introduce Estelle. Welcome to the show, Estelle.
Hello, Anne-Marie. Thank you for having me on your show.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk about you and the work that you do, because yes, this is an area that many people who are coming up to retirement can struggle with. And I know that this is an area that you love to support people in. Share a little bit, if you would, about your journey to becoming a retirement life coach. What led you down that path?
Look, it's been a meandering journey, Anne-Marie. I've been on the fringes of life coaching for quite some time, but I've just loved it. I did a counselling training and a life coaching training, and I decided that life coaching was far more positive and forward-looking than counselling. They both have their place in other people's lives, but for me, life coaching was the way forward because it is so solution-focused. And we keep looking ahead. We have to spend a little bit of time looking behind sometimes, but not very often with life coaching.
Yes, I love that. And then, of course, you then specialized even further in the area of supporting people looking forward when it comes to retirement, and particularly working, as we mentioned in the introduction, with educators, health workers, and social workers. Why in the area of retirement, and why educators, health workers, and social workers, Estelle?
Firstly, retirement can be sprung upon us unexpectedly. We all, when we're working full time in our professions, we look forward to retirement, and we sort of have a bit of a plan in our head. And then unexpected things happen. We might be made redundant. We might have a health issue that prevents us from continuing to work. Or there might be a change in your family circumstances that really impacts you. So retirement is a tricky time in life because none of us know the future ahead, and retirement is actually in the top 10 on the Rahim stress scale of life events, even though that's it. Most people think, oh, retirement, that's going to be a real breeze. I'm going to really enjoy that.
Yes.
And most people do. But for some people, there's just this little hesitation. They're a bit too scared to jump out of that full-time professional role because they're not quite sure what's going to fill all those hours that they may have spent at work, or they're not quite sure usually the number one thing is, do I have enough money to retire? That causes a lot of anxiety for people. Sometimes we just need a little bit of a helping hand along the way.
Yes. One of the things that I know, and you've mentioned this in conversations that we've had too, and I think this is something that may be very much aligned with one of the areas that people struggle with in retirement is, when I leave that full-time role, what's my identity? Because I'm no longer a this or a that. Speak a little bit about that, because I'm sure that often comes up in conversations with clients.
Yes, it certainly does. And especially for the people that I focus on, the educators, the social workers, the health workers, because they're in what I call the nurturing professions. Those people spend a lot of time looking after others, and they tend not to put aside time to look after themselves and to think ahead for themselves and plan what's the next stage for me. So this can cause a bit more stress for them. If I'm not a teacher, if I'm not a nurse, if I'm not a social worker, what am I going to be? Even for people out of nurturing professions, it's a bit of a conundrum. And you're right, it is a question of identity. It's something, I don't think you can take off your teacher or your nurse hat and then put on your retirement hat the next day, though some people do try to do that. It's a bit of a journey, a bit of a transition from one identity to the next identity.
Yes.
And people, as we get older, we tend to become, other needs come into our personal lives, like we might become grandparents, and then we have to stop and think, well, how do I want to be a grandparent? What sort of legacy do I want to leave for my grandchildren? Or you might think, I don't want to fully retire. I just want to, I still want to work and give back to society, but I'm not quite sure how I go about that, or what is it that I am meant to be doing for the next stage in my life.
Yeah, it sounds like when you say the word or give the word a definition, if you will, retirement can end up looking very different for people and what it means to them. As you say, some people may not. And I know that you've had conversations with some people that, I'm never going to give up work fully. There's always going to be something, and that's fine. It's like almost like a portfolio career, if you will. You've got a number of different involvements. Well, in retirement, you've got a number of different involvements too. Some may still be in paid work, but not necessarily full time. And I would imagine, being that you work particularly with those educators, health workers and social workers, those nurturing professionals, they're in those roles because they care. They want to support people. That is very much part of that identity. So as soon as you may close a door in one chapter of your life with working with an organisation or institution, doesn't mean that you suddenly switch that off. You very much, that becomes part of that. But let's talk about knowledge is never a burden. And I would imagine that in some instances it can be a burden. So let's unpack this a little bit.
This is part of my upbringing, Anne-Marie. I had very wise parents, and I consider myself fortunate to have had the parents that I did have. And it was especially my mother. She taught myself and my siblings that knowledge is never a burden. And that has become, that's taken up a large part of my personal life, is that I became a teacher, an educator myself, and I've been an educator all my life. And it's amazing sometimes the difference that a little bit of knowledge makes to a person. People talk about following a particular path and then they're not quite sure which way to go. Should they turn left? Should they turn right? And it's that extra little bit of knowledge that can sometimes make the difference as to which path they choose for themselves. Is it the left path or the right path? So
Yes.
the and I suppose my mother taught me that when you stop trying to learn, it means you're almost out of life altogether. So that's been a huge influence on me, and I loved it when I was an educator in the traditional classroom myself. Those children are just naturally curious and they love to learn. And as an adult, assisting other people to learn more about the pathway for their own life, it just makes my heart sing when I see that they've learned a little bit more about themselves and a little bit more about life and situation around them, and they're managing it in a different way. They're living their life slightly differently, that's progressing them forwards.
Yes. I mean, being that you have had experience and training in counselling as well as coaching, and I know you're very you're learning. I mean, you walk that talk. You're forever learning new things, and I know within that coaching space as well. One of the greatest gifts that I believe anyone can give themselves is to have a deeper understanding of themselves. What makes me tick? Why do I tend to make choices that way rather than another way? And the reason is because sometimes what we can do as individuals is place expectations on ourselves, which just doesn't, it's not going to impact us the way that it may someone else. And I think as nurturing professionals, one of the things that we often do, and you said this before, is we put others' needs above our own. But there comes a time where we need to understand, hang on a minute, I have to take some time out, because if we continue to give, which is the natural propensity of nurturing in the caring profession, and they don't take back an opportunity to reset and restore their own energy, they can get to a stage where they're not, they're just exhausted. And when you're exhausted as a nurturing professional or a carer, it's very difficult to give to others. Speak a little bit about that, because sometimes for many people, I'm sure, is getting to that stage where they are able to say, I'm going to give myself permission to spend some time on working on me, supporting me. That would be something that I'm sure you have to work with, yes?
Yes. When I talk to social workers, teachers, health workers who have had decades of professional life, some of them say things like, oh, I'm just hanging out till the end of the year and then I can retire. And they talk about the fact that they are not necessarily valued as they were when they were younger, that their ideas in their professional workspace are seen as a bit old hat. And they see new ideas being brought forward and they look at them and they say, inside their head, they say, but we did that 20 years ago. That's just a similar thing with a new name. That's something I did, I tried that as a young professional and it worked to some degree, but in other ways it didn't work. So I'm over this. I'm tired of having to adapt to these new ideas in my profession.
It's so true, isn't it? And there is a saying that says there's nothing new under the sun. It often can be rehashed, as you said. We'll put another new label on it and we'll call it innovation. Whereas, and what really saddens me when I hear you share that, some of the older generations still working in our workforces that may not be leveraged, if you will, not be sought upon to share their knowledge, because I believe there's a wealth and a depth, there's a richness of understanding that can only be developed through experience and years, because you cannot, when I say you cannot, but to give you a foresight and insight, if you base that on hindsight often and what's happened in the past, can give you a richness that you just wouldn't. So, I can see that is that could be an area where there's some disappointment there and not feeling of worthiness, as that they are coming to the end of what you might say is their careers, or particular opportunity, if you will. And one of the things that you say is learning to listen to others. And I think that beautifully segues into that, because sometimes to be able to express and be heard, we have to have the ability to be able to learn to listen to others as well. Speak a little bit more about this, Estelle.
This is something that I have learnt. It was later in my life when I learnt to listen more attentively. And I discovered that you learn so much when you listen. And I also found that I didn't have to prove who I was if I learnt to listen to other people. And often there's a lot of discourse in the world purely because people don't listen to the other person in their conversation. We tend to be very anxious to put forward our point of view, and if we continue to listen, we learn so much more about the speaker's situation, about what they are really looking for in any particular circumstance. And it's and then as a coach, of course, it's my job is to ask the right question after I have listened to what they have to say. But listening is very important. And I confess I find it very difficult in social situations when people, I observe people not listening attentively or giving the speaker the respect, and by staying silent and continuing to listen.
Yes.
But that's something I've learned to manage. So it's not a problem.
What? I think when you do that, there are things that, and I mean, you're trained as a coach, obviously, and the work is to you hear the saying, read between the lines. It's always a listening between the lines as well, between the words, if you will, because often it's the unspoken communication that listening attentively will allow you to, when you do ask that right question, that can give a deeper understanding and deeper meaning. And as you're sharing that, one of the things that I would imagine is true too, when you're working with someone that has a lot of complexities with their life, and there's a lot of different pressures and things. And as we know, each of the professions that you work with, which are the educators, the health workers and social workers, because of what's happened in the world, every single one of them has been impacted. You know, when you think of teachers who've had to go and train online, I've got family who are teachers who have just retired on that cusp, and they think, I'm glad I retired in 2019 because I don't know whether we would have been able to cope 2020 and delivering a lot of that online. Health workers, they're right at the forefront of what's going on.
Absolutely.
And of course, social workers are working with the impact of what's happening with families and in the community and so forth. You know, and sometimes we want to kind of layer issue over issue and sort of taking that step back. Whereas, as you say, with listening, taking that step back and unpacking so that it doesn't feel like this big weight can almost be, at least a step forward to being able to start to look at things individually, if I will, rather than a huge complex situation. Share a little bit about what you're seeing going on at the moment with, kind of with educators, health workers, and of course social workers.
Yes, your description is very apt, Anne-Marie. I call it pivoting. That's a very common phrase now, especially when you look at educators at all levels. And one day they're teaching face-to-face and the next day they're back online. And the teachers that I've spoken to, they've all said, they just love it when they get back to classroom teaching face-to-face. That sure, they can manage the technology and do the online learning for their students, but it's a bit of an added stress for them to make that quick adaptation. to being back online, and yeah, they just love that that relationship that they have when their students are actually right in front of them. And it's the same for the nurses. You know, you can't nurse remotely, can you? If you've got a good connection with your patient, you are there with your bedside manner, assisting them, supporting them, not just from a medical point of view, but also from the viewpoint of encouraging them to, to get well, to get better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's talk about loyalty being a detriment as well as a benefit. What do you mean about that, Estelle?
Yeah, it's a mixture of things for me. I suppose I realised it in my own life first. I'd had a friend for a long time, and I found that it became a draining sort of a relationship between the two of us. And so at one point I had to make a decision, do I want to continue this connection with this person or not? So I decided, well, I won't be the one to make the phone call for the next catch up. I'll just see what happens. And I did struggle with it, but finally I realised that the connection with this particular person was just too draining, and I didn't need that in my life. And it can be the same in business relationships. We struggle. I always believe in giving people second chances, third chances. But yes, we've got to, as a coach, we've got to decide, is this a client that is right for me, for my business? And even those businesses that we interact with on the periphery of our main core business, we've got to decide, is this, if I continue to have a connection and a relationship with this outside business, is this the right one for my particular business?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a balancing act.
I think that's such a fair comment that you made, because, I mean, of course, this podcast is called the Christian Entrepreneurs Podcast, and you're very much a woman of faith as well. You love the Lord, and often as Christians, we believe that, well, we have to get on with everyone. Well, of course, we're told that we need to love others as Christ loved us. However, he didn't say, and you necessarily need to continue to walk closely in their journey, even if it does, drain you from your energy. You don't need to do that at all. I mean, obviously, if it's a family member, there's going to be some strong boundaries that you can put around yourself. Yeah. But there are things that you need to do. And it is talking about boundaries. I'd love for you to share a little bit more about boundaries, if you would, Estelle, because it very much aligns with what we've been talking about before. And I know as nurturing professionals, educators, health workers, and social workers, those people who are very much the nurturers can often have leaky boundaries. What would you call? Let's define firstly. What's a boundary?
That's a good question, Anne-Marie. It's putting in place an expectation for the other person and for yourself, so that when you enter into a connection, that the other person has some idea of what they're going to come out with, and you go into the connecting with them with a good idea of what you are expecting out of the relationship.
Yes.
It's can be very tricky to establish those boundaries, and
yes,
that's what life's about a lot of the time, isn't it? Is learning how to establish the boundaries.
Yeah. And I love the way that you've defined that, because a lot of times we're not clear on our boundaries. We haven't defined what that is. And I love the way that you've said, in some instances you can interact with certain types of people or be in circumstances which can drain you from your energy, and then there's other instances, and you just suddenly disappeared, Estelle. So I'm not sure if something's going on with your camera. We can still hear you. I'll just continue to.
Looks like your camera is unplugged. Oh,
There you
Okay,
go.
you can still hear me. That's
I can
good.
still hear you. I don't know. So I don't
Mm,
know whether you can fiddle there and see whether something might have
yeah.
unplugged. But anyway,
Um,
we'll continue on as if the show goes on, as you say. So it's clarifying those particular boundaries. And then there's another thing that requires even more willpower, if you will, in maintaining them and standing up for them, so that if you do put it like a barrier on time, there you go, back again. If you put a boundary on time, yet you keep being asked to give more and more and more time, there
mhm.
needs to be a skill learning or a way that we can approach and have a conversation to say, to put that into, but to share a little bit more about that, because I'm sure this is something that you support your clients, being that they're very much nurturing professionals. How do we maintain those boundaries?
Yes, you're right. They do struggle with it. It's not just their nurturing innate instinct that sometimes makes those leaky boundaries. It's competition within their workplace. Like I had a teacher ring me a few weeks ago, very upset because a student had thrown a shoe at her in her class. And she sought support from her leadership team, which she received. And the leadership team said to her, now, go home. We'll look after your students. That's not a problem. But she just couldn't bring herself to leave the classroom and her workplace until about 2 hours of staying there and making sure that the next class was organised, making sure that her students with those particular special needs were informed that she wouldn't be taking the next class. Yes, it just seemed so foreign to her to head for home when she was in a place of great need to look after herself, but she couldn't bring herself to do it until she had attended to those other needs.
Yes.
So they really do struggle with those boundaries. It's a bit of competition. If you're looking for a promotion, you don't want to be the first one to leave at the end of your shift, or be seen to be in too much of a hurry to get home because something might come up while in the first 5 minutes after you leave that might give you an opportunity to look as if you really do care and you really do want this job and you really do want to go for the next promotion. So, yes, it is a struggle for those nurturing.
I love the way that, just by speaking and often the first step forward is to expose it or to talk about it, to bring it out into the open, because it's very difficult for you to come up with a strategy on, well, how can we move forward from that? And that's an area where you can certainly support people in. But firstly, we've got to bring awareness to it and then look at, well, what can we do to be able to support us in shifting that, in creating some mechanisms that boundary is important. And I know that if you think about a nurturer, that you can empower others while you empower yourself. That's so important. And I'm sure being a nurturing profession yourself and being a nurturer, just as part of who you are, your characteristic, your approach, Estelle, you've come to learn to be able to do both, which I'm sure is one of the reasons why you love to support other nurturing professionals. Share a little bit more about your work and how people can get in contact with you, because yes, you help people transition to retirement, but being a retirement life coach, you're also able to help them navigate so that when they do reach up in everyone's journey towards some form of retirement, whatever that means to you, there's some things that you need to navigate, and you do that so well with them. How can people find out more about what you do and connect with you, Estelle?
Okay, you can find me at retirementlife.coach, and on there you'll find some podcast episodes that I've produced informing and educating people about retirement, about the resources that you need for a successful retirement. It's everybody knows what they are retiring from, but not everybody is aware of what they are retiring to.
Yeah.
And that's where the confusion and the uncertainty creeps in. Sorry, Anne-Marie, I've just recapped that, the last part of that question.
Yes. So retirementlife.coach. And yes, you've got beautiful podcast resources there, and you've got some tools that are incorporated within that as well. Do you want to share a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah. Yes. This is to give clients an idea of where they are at in their life. There's a tool called the Wheel of Life, and it looks at the different sections that our lives are made up of, with it be our relationships, our finances, our time that we commit to work, the time that we want to put aside for recreation. So that's an easy tool that clients can make an assessment of where they are at. And that tool is a jumping off point for our coaching sessions, our time together, to work out, is there a big gap in a client's life that they do need to do a bit of work with? And the other tool that's there at retirementlife.coach and mentioned in my podcast is a little quiz, there's 6 sections to it, about readiness for retirement. Some people find this really helpful because they can go through the quiz and find out what's the part of their plan for their retirement that they need a little bit of assistance and input for. As I said before, most people think it's the money, but that is not necessarily so. My desire to retire is all about the non-financial aspects of adjusting to the next stage in your life.
Yes. Yeah. Things that you mentioned, and I love this saying, and it speaks beautifully into how I'm sure this quiz and checklist can be so beneficial. We are as strong as our weakest link. So whilst you are maybe really strong in 5 of those different areas, there may be that last one that is the reason that's keeping you from progressing, that, and no one wants to feel that they're forced into something, and just being able to speak with someone to help unpack, get clarity on what that is, and then be able to move forward, I think is so very important. So retirementlife.coach. Great resources there. You've got your own podcast. And is your podcast the same name as the Retirement Life? What's the name of your podcast?
The podcast series is called Desire to Retire. Then there's a little hook line, desire to retire, but something is holding you back. So that's for those people who, they know that they want to move forward to the next stage of their life, but they're just not sure what it is or how you go about it.
And I think something that you mentioned earlier, and many people may be experiencing this now, there's uncertainty that's holding them back, that has been caused by something that's not necessarily of their own volition, if you will. There's been many people that have had circumstances change because of, where they're working, their place of employment, redundancy, I think, and being able to navigate through some of those emotional things, which often is not really addressed, but so important, isn't it? So important as a coach. I'm sure you'd know that, as individuals, the things that happen in between here or here and here can often really keep us from moving forward with intention and clarity and certainty and confidence. I think it all really makes sense. So look, Estelle, it's been wonderful to speak with you today. One of the things that I often do at the end of this particular podcast is just to finish with a word of prayer. So may I do that for you?
Yeah, sure.
Right, let's pray. Father God, thank you for the opportunity to speak with Estelle today and learn more about the work that she does, particularly helping those nurturing, caring professionals in transitioning to retirement with confidence, with clarity, whatever retirement means for them. Father, we just want to continue to uphold Estelle and the work that she's doing in prayer. We continue to bless the work and the clients that she is working with, because coming to that end of a career, whatever opportunity, when we're able to do that and navigate through that well, not only are we saying goodbye or finishing to something, we're also far more able to focus and move confidently forward toward whatever that next stage in life is. So we ask that you continue to bless the work that she's doing. We ask this in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
It's been absolutely lovely, and I really highly recommend that people go and listen to the podcast as well. And I know that you've had this shared to you before by a number of people, to say that when they listen, you've got such a beautiful calmness in your voice, just listening to you share, and that's a real thrill as well. So thanks once again for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Anne-Marie. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by theinfluencealliance.com. Want to influence real change with your message by becoming known as a trusted authority in your industry while building a sustainable and scalable business you love? Find out how by accessing our free podcast series at www.theinfluencealliance.com/podcast series. That's theinfluencealliance.com/podcast series.